We all were praying for you.
Thank you. I appreciated it so much, and God just opened my eyes. You know, I was that stubborn, don't need the vaccine.
Yeah.
I'll be fine, I'll be okay. And, oh wow, I should have taken it. So, but it all worked out.
Amen. Well, we're glad you're back with us.
Love you guys.
Yeah. And it's good. We're glad to have you with us, Charlotte, and all the rest of you. And those that may be joining us live streaming, we're glad to have you with us as well. But this morning, we are looking at session 6 on the life of Elijah. There's much that we have not covered, and this is the end of our study of Elijah and his ministry. But his ministry did go, we see the end of his ministry here, but there are parts of his ministry that we have not looked at. And so I think you would be blessed if you would go back and reread how God called him and how he used him in some very significant ways. And this morning we're looking and studying lead others to serve. And we're seeing in this how God first had instructed Elijah when he ran in fear of Jezebel and went all the way to Mount Sinai. In the scriptures it's called Mount Horeb. Just a name change, but the same mountain. And how there he cowered in a cave, and God called him to come out because he was going to pass by. And you remember the dynamic of all the wind and the earthquake and the breaking, shattering of rocks. And it says that that wasn't God. But God did speak to Elijah at that point and ask him again, what are you doing here? Which was a good question, but one that perhaps all of us need to hear the Lord speak to us. What are we doing here? But after that, instead of speaking to Elijah's fear, he said, I've got 3 things I want you to do. And one was to go to Aram, or to Syria, and anoint the king there. And he said, this king will kill a lot of Ahab's army and family. And that did take place. The king of Syria was also killed, and but he also wreaked a lot of destruction on the northern kingdom, Ahab's kingdom. And also to anoint Jehu to be king in place of Ahab. And he did that. He called Jehu out and anointed him. And Jehu didn't assume the kingship immediately. But in a couple of years, he did, and he killed Ahab, and he did exactly what God told Elijah to say. All of your family, all of your relatives, all of your whole family clan will be killed. And they were. Jehu took care of that. And then the third thing he said, and I want you to go to Abel-Meholah, Abel-Meholah, which is a town that I've got circled here if you can see the circle. And there I want you to call Elisha, and his name, by the way, means my God is Jehovah. I want you to call Elisha to be your servant and to succeed you. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. And his calling of Elisha was the last thing that Elijah, the story that we're looking at today is the last part of Elijah's ministry here on earth. And we'll be looking at all of that. But so we assume that he first went to Syria and then back and found Jehu before he went to across the river to where all these things took place. We don't know exactly in what order it was that he went and called Elijah, Elisha. He may have gone directly from Horeb to Abel Maholath, and called him there, and took him with him to Syria and to anoint Jehu. We're not sure. That's not clear in the scriptures, and really is not important. But what did happen was that as he called Elisha realized that it was a call from the Lord. And so the topic this morning, as we look at it, is, we all have a finite presence here on earth. And yet the Lord's work goes on. We had the apostles, but the apostles are not with us anymore. We had the apostle Paul, but he trained up Timothy's and Silas's and Barnabas's to succeed him and to continue and expand the work. We also face a finite existence here on earth. And so we need to be training and calling, helping others to assume not only what we're doing, but to expand the ministry that they will be in. And so, that's the whole point of this lesson today, is to lead others to serve God. I dare say every one of you have served in some capacity in the church and are perhaps serving still. But we all face a time when we will be passing from this place to heaven. And so we need to train up, encourage others to be ready to assume or to work with us, as Elisha did, helping Elijah, until that day comes when we are no longer here, and when there will be others that will step in and take our place. May not do it the way that we have done it in the past, but it is important that we help lead others to serve the Lord. We're looking today at 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 19 through 21, and then 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 6 through 14. Everyone wants their 15 minutes of fame, so the saying goes. That statement speaks to the obsession of so many to know and be admired, and it also points to the fleeting nature of such fame, 15 minutes. In contrast, some people don't focus on themselves, but they desire to leave a spiritual legacy, knowing it's more important to lead others to follow Christ. Those who have gone before us paved the way for us to know Christ and serve Him, and we can do the same for others. There have been some really important and influential people in my life, aside from my mom and dad and sister. Whenever I was in college, I served as a minister of music or a music leader in a couple of different churches, 3 different churches. But one of those pastors was really a man of great prayer, and honestly, a man of great spiritual power. He was basically a deeply uneducated man. So his English was not good, but his messages were really powerful. He was saved when he was an older man and a successful man in business. He had a trucking company. And yet he was a man of great faith and had a great influence on me in my life, of just setting before me an example. It's not that we spent a lot of time together, although we did. He invited me to his home. He had 2 boys that were a little younger than me. And we had fellowship together, but just watching how he lived and how he served was a great influence on me. After I left seminary, I went to Ohio to start a new church. And the minister of missions, the director of missions there, Ross Hughes, was a great example to me. He had a great vision of what he felt God wanted to do in that part of Ohio, where there were few Southern Baptist churches and not a lot of evangelical churches. And I caught the vision from him that God wanted us to multiply. Not only to start churches, but to start churches that will start churches and to train people who will continue doing what God has called us to do. He was a great leader and a great example, and I spent a lot of time with him, traveling with him. He'd come to my services, but usually he would go into other services. But a great witness to me, and his wife also was a great example of the wife of a missionary, the wife of a pastor, and how they served. And then on the mission field, several great leaders that influenced me, encouraged me. And on the mission field, I faced some discouragement as a missionary, a lot of discouragement as a missionary. A lot of it came from fellow missionaries. But nonetheless, there were those who stood with me, encouraged me, prayed for me, and led me in what I still feel was the right direction. So I'm sure that you in your life can look back and recount people of significance in your life. You need to be that kind of person. We need to be that kind of people to others. To share with them the vision that God has given us. To help them see how they can develop. And that's what we're going to look at today in the scripture with Elijah and Elisha. The setting was, having encouraged Elijah at Mount Horeb, or Sinai, God sent him to anoint new kings over Syria and Israel, and set apart Elisha as his successor. Anointing Elisha did not signal the end of Elijah's ministry, because Elisha became Elijah's attendant and student. Not only did Elijah minister to Elisha, but Elisha undoubtedly brought great comfort and encouragement to Elijah. The Lord used these two prophets who served primarily in Israel as heralds of his word. So let's look at this first passage of scripture, 1 Kings 19, verses 19 through 21. And let's read this aloud together. Elijah left there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat, as he was plowing. 12 teams of oxen were in front of him, and he was with the 12th team. Elijah walked by him and threw his mantle over him. Elisha left the oxen, ran to follow Elijah, and said, "Please let me kiss my father and mother, and then I will follow you." Excuse me. That's bad. "And I will follow you." "Go on back," he replied, "for what I have done to you. For what have I done to you?" So he turned back from following him, took the team of oxen, and slaughtered them. With the oxen's wooden yoke and plow, he cooked the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he left, followed Elijah, and served him. So Elijah left Horeb, evidently, and went to where Elisha was. Now, how he knew exactly who he was calling, I have no idea, but it's quite evident that God was leading him in this. And so he goes to Elisha, the son of Shaphat. And as he was plowing, working in the field, he had 12 yoke of oxen. That's two oxen to the yoke. And so he had at least 24 oxen. This man was no poor man. He was plowing in the field, and the field was large enough, it had 12 yoke of oxen plowing in the field. This man was no poor man. And so God sent him not to the poor, but he sent him to this particular man. Evidently, Elisha was already a follower of God. Do you remember when Elijah was on Mount Carmel? God tells him, "I have 7,000 people who have not bowed their knee to Baal." You keep saying, "You're the only one left." No, you're not. There's a lot of others that have not bowed to Baal. And Elisha was obviously, he and perhaps his entire family were such. And so Elijah, whenever Elijah walks by Elisha, he just takes his mantle that God had given him, and he just throws it over on the head of Elisha. Elisha knew what that meant. He evidently had been with the prophets or around the prophets of God, and so he knew that he had been called to come and serve.
What's a mantle?
A mantle like a
Headscarf.
headscarf or something that they would wear. I mean, out in the hot area, they didn't have caps evidently, so they wore mantles. Or you can put it over your shoulders, as you know, or wrap it around your waist, or put it over your head, whatever. And it was evidently made of hair. I don't know whether human hair, horse hair, what kind of hair, but it was not necessarily a comfortable thing, but it was usually quite a warm thing. And so he throws the mantle over on Elisha. And Elisha, realizing that he had been called, he likely even knew who Elijah was. I mean, Elijah was quite notorious in that country. Remember how he had confronted Ahab? And how they had seen the 3 years of drought? And how then they had had the contest at Mount Carmel? He may have even been at Mount Carmel. I have no idea. And how the rains then came at the declaration of Elijah. This was not something that was done in a corner secretly. Probably the whole kingdom heard these rumors. There was no newspapers, no internet, and no television or radio then, but there was an awful lot of neighbors sharing with neighbors and people sharing in the marketplace. I mean, that was the place of information. If you go to the marketplace, you hear all the scuttlebutt and all of the news. So Elisha, I'm sure he knew what this meant because of the way he responded. He left the oxygen and followed Elijah and said, he knew what the mantle on him meant coming from Elijah. And so he says, please let me kiss my father and mother, and then I will follow you. Now, do we know of a Bible story that's similar to this? What is it? Don, you shook your head. What is it?
In the New Testament, I don't know where it is, but he said, let me go home, and he said, that's not a good deal.
Yeah.
That's
He
what
said,
Jesus
let me first go back and
That's what Jesus
take care of my
said.
mom and dad. And the words are similar. And Jesus says, no, that's not what it is. That's not what I've called you to do. So the words are similar, but evidently the intent was different. Elisha had ran after Elijah and said, essentially, I will follow you. And so Elijah says, then go on back. Well, what have I done to you? That question is a little bit vague. You can take it to be, have I done something? Have I put you in a hard place? Or it can be, yeah, go ahead and do. I've called you to ministry and you're accepting to go, and you do need to say goodbye to your parents. Whatever it was, whatever that question really means, Elisha took that as permission, and he turned back from following him. Evidently, he went to his parents. It doesn't say that explicitly, but he did turn back. And then he took his team of oxen and killed them and had a great feast. Now, some have said in killing the oxen, it must have been like a sacrifice, but there's no altar mentioned here. This was not a sacrifice, this was a feast. It was a time of celebration. Doubtless his parents were there. Doubtless he had probably invited the neighbors. And he had all of his own workers and servants there. I mean, 2 oxen, that's lots of meat. And so for the wood, and this caught my attention, he took the wooden yoke and plow. My concept of a plow is that it's metal. But this was 3,000 years ago or more. The plows were often made of wood. Or a wood with a little bit of metal on it just to cover where the soil comes up. I don't know which it was, but at least the thing that held the plow point would be wood for sure. You can still find plows in the third world or the fourth world that are simply wood that scrape across the ground. It's not like getting on a John Deere and driving a three bottom plow down through the field at all. This was just whatever it was, but it had a lot of wood to it. And so the yoke, which is heavy wood, and then the plow and all of the stuff connecting it, he took all of that out of his team and used it for wood to cook all of this meat. And he gave it to the people, and they ate. And doubtless to say, this was an important time in his life. It was a celebration in his life that he had been called to serve God, his God. And that he was announcing that to his family and to his neighbors and to his servants. Now that still leaves 11 yokes of oxen here. And probably still the family, all of the property is still in the family. There may have been younger brothers there, I have no idea. But he didn't sell his land, but doubtless he was a landowner or part of a family that owned a good bit of land and a good bit of other farming equipment. So he was not just leaving a poverty-stricken area to go somewhere, very different from Elijah. Elijah, we have no idea what his background was. But he evidently didn't have any money, or very little of it. You know, whenever God told him to flee Ahab and go to the little stream, and that the stream and the ravens would feed him and give him water to drink, he didn't have any money to buy anything. God took care of that. And when he went to Zarephath to live with the widow, he didn't go in with money in his hand. He went in asking for a cup of water and a piece of bread. So Elijah's life and background appears to have been very different than that of Elisha. And also Elijah, in reading through on the life of Elijah and Elisha, all of the commentators again and again say Elijah was far and above a prophet over and opposed to Elisha. Elisha was his helper. Elisha, we have record of more miracles that Elisha actually did, but Elijah faced opposition wherever he went. Whenever he goes face to face with Ahab the king, when he goes face to face with Jezebel, whenever he is dealing with the prophets of Baal. These were important encounters. And so he had high points in his life, but he also had those low points. You remember how he would be despondent, discouraged. He would run and hide. And so God uses Elijah to call Elisha to be his successor. Any questions here? Let's look at some questions here. What evidence do you see in these verses that indicate Elijah had either recovered from his discouragement or had, as the Lord would have him, decided to move forward to be a faithful servant even when discouraged? What do we see here?
He did what God asked him to do.
He did. Whether it was in discouragement or not, we don't know. It's not clear. God gave him a new directive. Okay, Elijah, go do this. And Elijah obeys. In fact, everything that God had asked him to do, Elijah did it. He was obedient. What positive message for us is seen in his going to Elisha?
Elisha made a strong commitment to
follow Elisha.
Yes, he did. Elijah had a strong commitment to follow God, and Elisha made a similar commitment. What is the positive message that we see in Elijah going to Elisha? Isn't it that he's thinking about the ongoing ministry of God? Elijah didn't look at his ministry as being one that's going to be concluded and that's going to be it. The Lord's going to come back, or whatever. He was preparing someone else to step into his role as the leader of the prophets and as the chief, if you will, among God's spokesmen in Israel. Identify some insights from Elisha that can be gleaned from these verses. What are some insights? Whenever Elijah calls him, what are some insights that we can gather from Elisha? That's a question.
He was ready to serve.
He was ready. Yeah, he responded immediately, didn't he? Okay, good. Something else?
He celebrated.
He did. He called everyone together and they celebrated. He responded with, it seems, joy. Didn't it? We don't find any hesitancy here on Elisha's part. He said, okay. And what else? What about his parents? Was it appropriate for him to go back to speak to his parents?
I think so.
Or his servants? What if he just walked off the field with Elijah and gone? They would have no idea, would they? And so, in celebrating and in sharing, which obviously he did, then he is also giving glory to the Lord for calling him into this ministry. What did Elisha do that symbolized his acknowledgement of the gravity of God's call on his life? What did he do?
Killed the oxen.
See?
Killed the oxen and had the feast.
Yeah, he did.
He wasn't coming back.
Yeah, that's right. He says, okay, that's my pair of oxen. I'm going to serve the Lord, and I don't need these anymore. So let's have a feast.
He
Yeah.
didn't have second thoughts about leaving his rich family to go to something that he probably didn't know where God was leading him.
Yeah. I mean, he had heard about Elijah, surely. Maybe he had even heard about him hiding out because the king kept hunting him. And then about the confrontation on Mount Carmel. I mean, he surely had heard these things. He didn't say, whoa, wait. There's a lot of suffering in all of this, isn't there? There's a lot of privation in there, isn't there? He didn't have second thoughts.
He didn't want Jezebel after him.
Yeah. And Jezebel was still alive at this time. That's exactly right. So some lessons from this. Obedience is always the right choice. Whatever God calls us to do, obeying what God calls us, as impossible a situation as it may look like, obedience is always the right thing for us to do. God calls people into his service, but we can be influential in helping them recognize it and respond to it. What if Elijah had never gone? What if he had not thrown the mantle on Elisha? This was how it dawned on Elisha. It wasn't that Elijah had called him into the ministry. It was that God, through Elijah, had called him into the ministry. God has an ongoing plan for accomplishing his will and purpose. It doesn't end with me. It doesn't end with you. There is more that our eyes will never see. But we need to train other people and call other people to carry on the task that God has given us. God's call on a person's life requires one to give up the past to claim the future. Good lessons. Let's look at the 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. So now, Elijah had done these several other things. He'd been in ministry. That was in 1 Kings. Now in 2 Kings chapter 2, we find the last day of Elijah and find what he's doing. Elijah says to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord is sending me to the Jordan." Now one of the things that in that, it says that Elijah went to Bethel. Now I tried to mark it. Here's Bethel here. So I mean this is where Elisha lived originally, but they had been all over this area. But then it says God called Elijah to go to Bethel. Now Elisha was Elijah's servant. He was just doing whatever Elijah asked him to do. And so at Bethel, we have record in the scriptures that there was a school of the prophets at Bethel. Something like a seminary, only not a seminary. And Elijah was the head of this school. He would go there and teach and counsel and encourage these prophets. There was another school down here at Jericho. And there was actually one up here in Gilgal. So these were three different schools of the prophets where the prophets of God, Jehovah God, were coming together to encourage one another, to study the scriptures, to pray together, etc. So the prophets at Gilgal, they went and saw the prophets at Bethel. And when they got to Bethel, the prophets pulled Elisha over and says, "You know, today God's going to take Elijah from you." And Elisha says, "Yeah, I know that. Just be quiet." And so then they go on to Jericho. And at Jericho, at the school of the prophets here, there were about 50 prophets there. And they're in there talking, and the prophets at Jericho comes to Elisha and says, "You know, God's going to take Elijah from you." And he says, "Yes, I know, just be quiet." And so then they all together go down to the River Jordan. Now this is the River Jordan right here. It runs into the Dead Sea. And when they come to the River Jordan, that's where we see this taking place. And so Elijah says to him, "Stay here, the Lord is sending me to the Jordan River." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men from the sons of the prophets came and stood observing them at a distance while the two of them stood by the Jordan River. Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water, which parted to the right and left. Have we ever seen this happen before?
Yes.
When was that?
Red Sea.
Moses, Red Sea.
No, it was another time, at the Jordan.
Oh, at the Jordan.
When the children of Israel crossed over into the promised land.
Right.
Remember, God said, "Take stones and put them out in the middle of the river," and he parted the river, and all the children of Israel walked through on dry land all across the Jordan River. Remember? Okay, we've seen the Jordan part. So here, the same kind of thing took place. Then the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And when they had crossed over, Elijah then said to Elisha, "Tell me what I can do for you before I'm taken from you." Now this was a new question, because before this, Elijah had said to Elisha, "Don't go with me to Bethel. You stay here." And he said, "No way, I'm going with you. Wherever you go, as long as you're here, as long as I'm here, we're going together." From Bethel to Jordan, Elijah said the same thing to Elisha. "Oh, you don't have to follow me. You just stay here. I'm going on." And Elisha says, "No way. I'm staying with you as long as I'm here, as long as you're here." Then whenever they get to Jordan, to Jericho, Elijah says to Elisha, oh, don't follow me. Just stay here. I'm going to go on down, and you don't need to go. And Elisha says the same thing again. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here with you. And so that's what he says, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. That is Elisha's statement these 2 or 3 times. So then the 2 of them crossed over on dry ground, and when they crossed over, Elijah says, now, this new question, tell me what I can do for you before I'm taken from you. Elijah knew that he was being taken. The prophets knew that he was going to be taken, and Elisha knew that he was going to be taken. Don't know that they knew how, but it was. And Elisha answered, please let me inherit 2 shares of your spirit. And Elijah replied, you've asked me for something difficult. If you see me being taken from you, you will have it. If not, you won't. And as they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire with horses of fire suddenly appeared and separated the 2 of them. And Elijah went into heaven in the whirlwind. Now, in this passage, there's a little bit of difficulty in how to translate it. And so some surmises, some guesses, some trying to figure out what that meant and put it into good English has occurred over the years. When Elisha says, please let me inherit 2 shares of your spirit, does that mean 2 shares of God's power? Or 2 shares of your own psyche, if you will, or soul? Or what does this mean? And there's been a lot of discussion between the translators. But probably a good reference point for us is in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17, where it talks about the portion that is given to the firstborn. He must acknowledge the son of his unloved wife. Now this is a part of it, but anyway, here's the important part. As the firstborn, by giving him a double share of all he has. It seems that what Elisha was asking of Elijah was to treat him as his firstborn. And actually, back whenever he was called and threw his mantle on Elisha, many interpret that as, in essence, Elisha seeing that as he was being adopted, as though Elijah were his father. He was his spiritual father. And so that in this, give me the double portion, is treat me as your firstborn. But also it says about your spirit, the 2 shares of your spirit. And now look at Elijah's answer. You have asked for something difficult. If you see me taken from you, you will have it. In other words, that two measures of my spirit, whether it was his spirit or the God's spirit or whatever, he says that is not anything in my control. That is something in God's control. You ask me something different, I can't grant that. So if you see me taken, if you are with me as my disciple, as my follower, as my student, as my trainee, when I'm taken, then you will have it. And if you're not with me, then, and don't see me taken, then you won't. In other words, he's not sure, because that's in God's hands. And so as they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire with horses of fire suddenly appeared and separated the 2 of them. That's fairly clear. This fire, chariots and horses, separated the 2 of them. They were walking together, and whatever it was, separated them. And then Elijah was taken up into heaven in the whirlwind. And this word whirlwind doesn't mean a tornado. It may not even mean whirlwind. what it means was there was a disturbance in the clouds. There was a disturbance in the storm that had arisen. And it doesn't define exactly what that disturbance is. And so the translators have tried to translate it into something that we would understand, and they made it into a whirlwind. They didn't say tornado, by the way, or hurricane. So it may not have been a whirlwind, but whatever it was, in this disturbance in the clouds, Elijah was taken up at that point. Sharon and I, when we went to Jordan, we did not visit, but we were right close to where Elijah, by tradition, was taken up into the clouds. We went to Jesus' baptism site. That is very clearly marked and held to be true, the true site where Jesus was baptized on the Jordan River. But right close to that was where Elijah was taken up. It's just out in the middle of a plain. It wasn't on a hill, wasn't on a mountain. This is down in the Jordan Valley. And you could see over there where it was, and it wasn't anything except just a plain, just a flat, level ground. It was probably a half a kilometer from us, maybe a half a mile from us. And we just didn't go over because there was nothing to see there except it was just a flat plain. They probably have some kind of a monument or a marker that Christians later put up there. I don't know. But it was at this place where Elijah was taken up into heaven. Do we have any other record in the Bible where someone was taken up similar or something like that?
We do, but I can't remember who it was.
Enoch?
Enoch it was.
Enoch, oh.
It said Enoch was, and he was no more. And then there's one more.
Melchizedek.
Jesus.
Who?
Jesus.
Yes, Jesus. And Jesus ascended into heaven. It's interesting. Now, we're getting into, we don't have much time, but let me just deal with this just briefly. One commentator that I read today, and Moses, by the way, is another one where God took him, and it says, and buried him, and no one has ever found his grave. That was probably a little different, but still, you remember who were the two that Jesus met on the Mount of Transfiguration? You remember, there were two Old Testament people.
Abraham and
Elijah.
Moses.
Who was it?
Was it Abraham and Moses?
No.
Elijah.
No, was Moses
Moses.
and Elijah.
Oh, actually, I said Elijah.
And Moses representing the law, because he, at God's leadership, gave the law. But Elijah was the evangelist. And he spoke about faith. And he lived by faith. And he obeyed the Lord. And so at Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah were the two that Jesus was talking with. You remember that now?
Mm-hmm.
Remember the Transfiguration, right? Where Peter, James, and John went with Jesus up on the Mount of Transfiguration. And there they saw Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. And Peter says, oh, we need to build three tabernacles for you, or 3 booths for you, 3. And then God spoke to them through the cloud and said, this is my son, listen and obey him. Anyway, some commentators say Elijah was taken up, and it precedes, or it is a diagnostic or pointing out how Jesus would also ascend into heaven. You can take that for what it's worth. Okay, let's look at some questions right quick. Why might Elijah have urged Elisha to stay in place rather than travel with him? Could have been for a test. Could have been for convenience. Don't know. But it could have been for many different reasons. But Elisha says, no way, I'm staying with you. What does Elisha's refusal say about his commitment to his mentor and to the Lord? No way, I'm not going to leave you, I'm staying with you. What does that say? What would that say to you?
He was
committed to learn.
He was
everything
committed.
he could
He
learn.
was a servant of Elijah, and he says, as long as you're here, I'm gonna be right there with you. What miraculous act did Elijah perform?
Part of the
Walked
waters.
over the river, dropped.
He did.
Dry river.
He struck the river and it parted. What endowment did Elisha ask Elijah for?
2 portions of his spirit.
2 portions of his spirit. What was Elijah's answer?
Not mine to give.
Yeah, that's tough for me, I can't do that. Describe the phenomenon of Elijah's translation to heaven and its symbolic elements. What did we see? Or what did Elisha see?
They said, Elijah told him, if you're here when I,
No, what were the things that they saw in his translation, or in his, translation into heaven? What happened?
Chariot of fire?
I'm sorry?
Chariot of fire?
Yes, chariot of fire and
horses.
horses.
Fiery horses.
Whirlwind?
Yeah,
Horses?
that's what he saw. That's how he describes it. Okay? So some lessons here. Faithful servants do care about what goes on even after their departure. For the service is more important than the servant. The service is more important than the servant. The ministry that God has called his people to is more important than the ones that he puts into it. He blesses us in permitting us to serve, but it is the service and the ongoing ministry to glorify God that is more important. Okay, some more lessons. Faithful service is more than filling a position. It is the determination and commitment to fulfill a calling. God's calling is evidenced by the work he does within us that becomes a witness to his presence. Great and mighty is the Lord, and he will provide for those who will carry on his work to his honor and glory. So the last part, 2 Kings 2:12-14. As Elisha watched, he